Thank you for attending President Biden's Pardons, What It Means for Cannabis and Criminal Justice Reform, hosted by the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center at The Ohio State University Moritz College of Law and the Last Prisoner Project. Before we begin, we have just a few notes we'd like to share with you. First, to streamline the appearance of the webinar, we suggest that you hide non-video participants. Second, we want to draw your attention to the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom window. You may submit your questions at any time. Please note, however, that there is limited time available for Q&A at the end of the webinar. Third, closed captioning has been enabled for this event. To change how you view the transcription or to hide it, click Live Transcript in the menu at the bottom of your Zoom window. Finally, this event is being recorded. The recording will be made available on the event page and social media channels as soon as possible after the event. Follow us at OSU Law DEPC to stay up to date on our research, programming, and future events. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the event. Doug?
Thank you so much, Holly, and thank you to everyone participating and attending this terrific and exciting event on President Biden's pardons, what it means for cannabis and criminal justice reform. I am Doug Berman. I'm the director of the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center here at the Ohio State University Moritz College of Law, and I'm incredibly grateful and fortunate to serve as the moderator for this discussion. We have three spectacular panelists. I'm going to give a little bit of bios for each of them, and then ask them to introduce themselves a little bit more if they're so inclined, and then we'll start with some Q&A. Not going to do long presentations at the outset. We're going to get right to a conversation, and all three of these folks have great knowledge and a range of knowledge from their work in this space, and I'm real excited to hear what they have to say to us this afternoon. So first, we're very, very fortunate to have Elizabeth Oyer. She is the pardon attorney, the U.S. pardon attorney working within the Justice Department. Prior to her appointment, she was the senior litigation counsel for the Office of the Federal Public Defender for Maryland, where she represented indigent defendants at all stages of proceedings in federal district court. That history coming into this role as the pardon attorney is quite notable and kind of worthy of its own engagement here. But I want to now let Liz just sort of say a few words about her background and the work that she does before we get into some specific questions and I introduce the other panelists.
Sure. Thank you, Doug, for the introduction. And I have to note that I am from a family of Michigan fans, so I'm sorry, but
okay.
But I'm happy to be here participating in this panel. My office has been tasked with implementing the application process for certificates of pardon, and I hope to be able to address the work that we're doing on that front today.
Yes, and we'll even let a Michigan legacy, so to speak, speak to that, and no biases here when we're all kind of rowing the same direction in terms of the importance of clemency and the work that you're doing that we're grateful for and eager to hear more about. Speaking of the broader work of clemency, we've got Jane Ann Murray joining us as well. She's a professor at the University of Minnesota Law School and also the director of their clemency project. And so maybe Jane, you talk a little bit about your work and say hi to everybody.
Hello, and thank you so much for having me here. Hello, Doug. I am a clinical professor at the University of Minnesota Law School, where I run a clemency clinic. I'm also a board member at NACDL, where up to recently I ran its trial penalty clemency project on a pro bono basis. And I wish I could have a sporting reference, just not my bag, but I do want to say I'm here in Amsterdam fortuitously because I was held over by fog, and I feel it's a very appropriate place for me to be presenting today.
So much for making yourself available, and sporting references are never required, though always appreciated. And so I don't know if I put you on the spot, Sarah, but Sarah Gersten, who's the executive director and general counsel of the Last Prisoner Project, and who's been, I should be sure to mention the Last Prisoner Project's helping to co-host and co-sponsor this event. So grateful for your participation and like to hear about your work and some thoughts before we get started with some specific questions.
Thank you, Doug. Very thrilled to be here with this incredible panel today. For those of you who are not familiar with the Last Prisoner Project, we are a national nonpartisan nonprofit that focuses on cannabis criminal justice reform. What that means is that we work to ensure that nobody continues to be incarcerated for cannabis, that cannabis convictions are cleared from individuals' records, and those that are returning home from incarceration have the reentry resources and support that they need. I don't have a good sporting reference, but I will say coming to this work actually from being an intellectual property attorney and being at the Copyright Office, I still get a kick out of hearing the emphasis on the Ohio State University, and that case I still find to be one of the most interesting copyright and trademark cases. So no sporting reference, but a little, I guess, IP attorney humor.
I'm glad we all can integrate our personalities, and I often joke that I don't know if they'll take away my tenure if I don't say the Ohio State University, but I don't want to find out. So, you know, it's a part of what becomes the brand for any of us who are here at Ohio State. With that background, and thank you all for introducing yourselves. Liz, I want to turn to you. I'm sure you may get tired of this question, but I think it's still important for this audience and kind of fundamental to understanding what we're talking about here. The particulars of President Biden's grant of pardons. These blanket pardons, you know, are themselves, you know, fairly rare. And I know that's played into the need to do the certificate process, which I want to hear about soon. But first and foremost, can you just sort of remind all of us, you know, who exactly were the recipients of these pardons, who, you know, that covers, and kind of, you know, what we think roughly the numbers are for that population that's now received this historic grant of clemency?
Sure. So the pardon that the president issued applies to anyone who was charged with or convicted of a federal marijuana possession offense or an offense under the DC code prior to the date of the proclamation, so October 6th of 2022. The pardon is very broad in terms of encompassing, we believe, many thousands of individuals who have these convictions. But it's important to note that it is limited to convictions for possession of marijuana. So it does not encompass all marijuana related offenses, for example, marijuana distribution offenses. We have not quantified the precise number of individuals that may be affected by this. And hopefully when we start to receive applications for certificates of pardon, we'll have a better sense of how broadly sweeping this is. But many thousands of people are going to be affected by this relief, and in fact have already been affected by the relief, which took effect on the date that it was issued, October 6th.
And that's a good point. I want to make sure there's clarity on that as well. Though there's this process set up, and I'd love to have you talk more about the process for getting a certificate that, I guess, documents that somebody is a recipient of this pardon. That's not kind of legally essential for getting the benefits or otherwise you know, being considered in the class of folks who receive the pardon. It's just a way to document it. And if you could talk sort of more about why it's important and what your expectations are in your office in issuing these certificates.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's very important to note that the pardon is self-effectuating. So if you had a conviction for marijuana possession on or before the date that the president issued this proclamation, October 6th of this year, you are pardoned. That is already in effect. You don't need any further evidence or any action to be taken to effectuate the terms of the pardon. However, we have been tasked, the Office of the Pardon Attorney has been tasked under the President's proclamation with coming up with a process for issuing certificates. So the certificate of pardon is just proof that your conviction has been pardoned under the terms of the proclamation. You don't need a certificate for the pardon to be effective, but individuals may want to obtain a certificate in order to have that proof in hand that they've been pardoned. Now, my guess is that many individuals are going to find that they don't actually need a certificate, but other individuals may find that they run into obstacles and that having a certificate is helpful in achieving the full benefits of the pardon, so that they can show someone a piece of paper saying, yes, I had that conviction, but it's been pardoned by the president. So the reason for issuing the certificates is so that individuals can obtain that proof, which may be helpful in achieving some of the benefits of the pardon. However, you do not need a certificate to be covered by the pardon.
Wonderful. And I saw, Jane Ann, you were nodding your head at one point, because absolutely essential that people understand that the benefits of this pardon is immediately applicable and you know, occurred as soon as President Biden made his announcement. But there are some, and we've seen this in the press, we've seen this elsewhere, that have been complaining that, not enough people are affected, or of course, the president has no authority to pardon state level offenses. And so I'm wondering if, especially given the work that you've done on clemency across the nation, your own sense of both the value and impact of a federal pardon under these circumstances, and also kind of what limits it has, or at least, what else, we need to be thinking about. We'll get in a minute, or maybe if you want to speak to it, the president made the call to state governors to follow his lead, but, where you think that leaves us in your own feel for, the place of these pardons in the broader clemency landscape.
Well, as you say, Doug, this is going to impact a lot of people, not everybody that we would hope to be impacted by clemency positions from the president, but there are 6,500 people automatically who get this benefit. There will also be, in addition, several people who are lawful permanent residents who will automatically get this benefit. And that's a huge number of people. It's not getting anybody out of prison, but it is a very symbolic statement about the decriminalization of this particular crime, and also recognition of the importance of granting that pardon, which is really a statement of forgiveness and the idea that we're accepting you back into society as a fully fledged member. And so that concept is so important in our current world, where 1/3 of American adults have a criminal record, and they carry that with them every day. So we've over 2 million people incarcerated, but we also have something over 70 million people have criminal records, which limit their access to jobs, to housing, to education, to licensure, to there's immigration context, immigration impacts for them. So we really need to address not just the number of people we have incarcerated, but also the number of people who are carrying these convictions with them that impact their daily lives. And so from a symbolic level, the president's pardon of marijuana possession is very powerful. Obviously, the federal level, we have a large number, but nothing like what we have at the state level. And so the next step is getting to the states to decriminalize at the state level. I just want to throw in one quick thing before you go to your next question is, just at the federal level, one way that we could have the kind of knock-on effect from this pardon is if the Sentencing Commission were to add marijuana possession to its list of excludable offenses, so you don't get criminal history points. And I would just throw in, let's make that retroactive. I mean, I have people in my docket, many people who went from category 3 to category 5 because of marijuana possession cases. So if we could just go back and fix those criminal history categories that drove offenses at the federal level to the point where people were getting several more years in prison, we could really make a difference there. So this is a very important symbolic act, obviously something I would love to see the president build on with lots of other categorical clemency proclamations, but it's a great step and something obviously we all welcome.
So I already have a bunch of follow-up questions, but I'm also seeing some very important clarification points in the Q&A that I want to make sure we get to. And Liz, I'm going to come back to you quickly just to clarify the point about where DC offenses fit in the blanket pardon, so that does the president's actions, the question goes, have any special impact there different than the states? And of course, the simple part of the answer is the president can't do any clemency vis-a-vis true state convictions, but as the question highlights, convictions in the District of Columbia are technically federal convictions. Are those also included within the blanket pardon? And maybe this is itself a broader question, vis-a-vis your work as the pardon attorney. Do you find that a disproportionate amount of applications that you're getting are coming from DC, because that's an area in which every conviction there is a federal conviction?
So that's absolutely right, that because of the way DC's courts are set up, which is different from the states, they are under federal jurisdiction and clemency can be granted only by the president. So President Biden chose to include District of Columbia convictions in his pardon proclamation. So anyone who has a conviction under the DC code is covered by the pardon under the same terms as anyone who has a federal conviction under Section 844 would be. The president does not have the authority to grant pardons to state law offenses. So individuals in the 50 states are not included within the president's pardon. And in general, the state's clemency processes are controlled by the governor of that state individually. So President Biden included in his proclamation federal offenses under the US code, as well as DC offenses under the DC code.
And that's a very important point to sort of follow up some other questions we're already starting to get to that I'll get back to. If President Biden were to grant additional clemencies to drug offenders more generally, he's certainly spoken about nonviolent drug offenders as a class and not just marijuana offenders as potentially subject to relief. That would be of great significance in the DC area for the same reason. So thank you for that, Liz, right away. Janet, I want to do one follow up with you before I turn to Sarah, which is to really focus on, you mentioned, and I think it's an incredibly important point, kind of the symbolic importance of the President of the United States saying these people should be pardoned for these kinds of offenses and all the different ways that can echo through criminal justice reform. He was quite specific in saying, I want state governors to do this. And the two things I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about, and I think Sarah may speak to the same issue, both specifically, your sense of how state governors are responding to that call from the president to follow his lead on marijuana offenses in particular, but maybe also sort of more broadly about whether you think the president, being historic and proactive in using his clemency power has an impact that ripples through the states and the work of governors more generally, that they just see this as a power that should be used more, or at least one that should be a more regular part of kind of their governance work. And I can actually speak to, we've been very lucky as a senator to work with Governor DeWine in the same sort of vein, not with the specific focus on marijuana offenses, but just generally using his pardon power more. And so I'm just sort of curious whether you think it will have that effect, or you think there's maybe reason to be hopeful, but not overly optimistic in changing how the clemency power is viewed more broadly.
Well, I do think we have reason to see this as hopeful, especially when we see states themselves, I wouldn't say necessarily independently, but adopting very policies about decriminalizing marijuana, and the report of the Collateral Consequences Resource Center, the brand new one, which is looking at marijuana reforms in 2022, really gives us a sense of how this is slowly having a snowball effect. So it's very powerful that the president has sort of joined it and also jump-started it in a way with this huge clemency. I just want to add that, I wish that there was some way that we could empirically prove it, but I view President Obama's major clemency initiative that impacted long-term prisoners incarcerated on low-level drug distribution crimes was a huge impact on the way society started looking at mandatory minimum penalties and people being incarcerated on drug cases generally, and people being incarcerated on long sentences. And I just think it was so powerful that our president brought previously incarcerated people into the Oval Office. It's just been a sea change. And whether he was riding a wave at that point or guiding it, certainly in my lifetime, and I was a federal, I've been a public defender for a long time prior to my work at the university. And I just feel the last 10 years have just seen a huge change in how we view mass incarceration and the importance of including impacted people in all the different reform measures. I absolutely have to think we must attribute some of that to President Obama bringing them into the Oval Office and going to prisons and making it such an important part of his administration towards the end.
Very good, Jane Ann. I appreciate that. And I think there's a lot there, and, seeing President Biden's work here in a broader tapestry. And I think, not just President Obama with his clemency initiative that was for all sorts of offenses, but even, looking at the bipartisan First Step Act becoming law. We've definitely seen, certainly, I think I share some of the same scar tissue of an era when it seemed like the only kinds of reforms were to move sentences up, and the clemency power was discussed as, how come it's not being used more? And now we are in a different time with a different set of awareness. And this sort of feeds into the questions I have for you, Sarah, and want to give you a chance to talk about the Last Prisoner Project's work here. It actually fits beautifully with one attendee's question. I'll read it directly because it captures it so well. Pardons certainly are an important first step, but criminal records carry a large penalty on the labor market and, the broader concern about expungement, record sealing. And I guess I'll start by just framing this for folks. That is another aspect of why President Biden's pardons are so notable at the federal level. There is no mechanism for general expungement for record sealing at the federal level. I think that's something that many people don't realize, because every state does have some kind of mechanism, not just for marijuana offenses, but for a range of offenses for some kind of record relief. And it really is a shame that at the federal level, we don't have anything comparable, and there have been bills, but they don't seem to be getting much movement to do that. But even with a formal expungement, even with a pardon, there's still so much work to do to help people get back to a positive life course. And I know LPP has been working on that front. You, Sarah, have been doing such important work in this space. If you want to sort of talk about that space and talk about your perspective on kind of, where these formal remedies, whether it's pardons or expungements, fit in, and then the broader work that needs to be done to help people with criminal records.
Yeah, and I do first just want to say, I think in answering that, I will touch on sort of the limitations of these federal pardons, but I do want to echo what Jane Ann has said in terms of the significance of this announcement. Though, of course, there are limitations to what a federal pardon effectuates for an individual. When we've seen presidents issue these kinds of categorical grants of clemency, like we saw when President Carter issued those for draft dodgers, it really signifies a shift in public perception around what once was perceived as criminal. And so it is incredibly significant for the sitting president to acknowledge through his executive authority of granting these categorical clemencies for possession that there has been a real sea change, of course, across the country, but also with the federal administration in terms of how we view cannabis. And I think importantly, what we saw in the other pieces of this announcement, first in terms of moving the administration towards descheduling or rescheduling, as well as the call to governors to do similar acts of clemency at the state level. President Biden is saying, there are limitations to what I can achieve federally, but I'm acknowledging that prohibition was wrong. Prohibition wasn't based in justice or fairness. It was based in racism. It was based in marginalizing certain communities. And I want to work to remedy that. So I do think, of course, that is a huge step forward. Though these pardons are limited. I think certainly when we're talking about the ramifications of the collateral consequences of having these convictions, a pardon can only go so far. As Liz stated, they're working to ensure that folks have kind of the certificate they approve to say, look, the president has stated that there has been a shift. This criminal conviction that is on my record isn't something that most individuals and most people in power believe should still be criminalized, should have this lasting consequence on my record. Unfortunately, it doesn't go as far as things like record clearance, expungement, erasure do at the state level. Things like expungement actually work to destroy the criminal record. That's as far as we can go in ensuring that individuals are no longer suffering those collateral consequences, be it in trying to find employment and finding assistance, financial assistance, housing. We know that the range of collateral consequences are so numerous and so multifaceted. So it is really important that we look to states to enact those kinds of provisions that would go further in achieving the kind of record clearance that we want to see. Luckily, I think we had already seen that occurring at the state level, particularly in those states that have already legalized cannabis for adult use. The first states that had legalized, Colorado, Oregon, were not as focused on the social justice aspects of legalization. That's really different from what we're seeing now in the newer states that are legalizing. When you look at a state like New York, New Jersey, those states are including in their legalization measures not only provisions that would effectuate record clearance, but also provisions that would effectuate resentencing or sentence modifications for those that are incarcerated, not just on simple possession, but broader categories of offenses, including things like paraphernalia, possession with intent to distribute, certain sales and distribution, manufacturing charges. And I think that's, what we want to be moving towards in terms of a gold standard for states. Of course, I will say no state has quite achieved what we would consider that gold standard, especially when it comes to effectuating the actual release of those that remain incarcerated. And I think that's a different question as to all of the difficulties and complexities of achieving that at the state level. But again, we are seeing more momentum there at the state level. And to your specific question, I'm heartened to see already some positive responses from governors in the wake of Biden encouraging states to do the same. The first, of course, was Governor Brown in Oregon, pardoning, I think it's upwards of 44,000 individuals that had these simple possession offenses in Oregon. And importantly, what happened in Oregon, because of that state's pardon law, those pardons actually do become expungements for the individuals. The statute essentially says that any pardoned offense will become expunged. So that's a critically important thing to distinguish. And secondly, what happened in Oregon was that the state and that administration went so far as to also clear fines and fees and restitution that were associated with those convictions. So I think we saw something like $14 million of fines and fees were waived. Obviously, that's a huge form of relief for the individuals that were saddled with that debt as a result of those convictions. So that's an example of a governor, seeing what the president has done and even going further to ensure that the kind of impact that we want to see in terms of both record clearance and other forms of forgiveness are attached to the pardon process.
First, a plug for some work that the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center has done in conjunction with the Collateral Consequences Resource Center. I think, Jane Ann, you may have referenced it in your comments. We actually worked together in early 2021 when there was a first wave of states, both through the 2020 initiative and right after that came online with legalization and highlighted that record relief was much more integral to their reforms and the legal changes there than we had seen in earlier rounds of reform. And same seems to be true. We're in the midst of finishing up an even more robust report about recent reforms that likewise kind of highlight the point that you were making, Sarah, which is that states are feeling more comfortable doing that as an integral part of marijuana reform. And I think these things synergize each other, right? That both the president kind of emphasizing the importance of record relief through the means that he can, encouraging the states to follow up. I'd also emphasize, and I guess I would love to hear from whoever would want to speak to this, I've noticed very little political pushback to the work that's being done there. That was probably true. You mentioned President Obama's initiative, Jane Ann, as well, where there probably wasn't as much political pushback as expected, but there was certainly some, and that itself is a sign of changing times. But my guess would be politicians across both the aisles notice that the president's mostly getting praise, and to the extent that he's getting criticized, it's criticized for the blanket pardons not going far enough. So I'm going to get to that issue now, Liz, as a warning. There have been a few questions specifically focused on the fact that undocumented individuals weren't included or were expressly excluded from the blanket pardon. And a number of folks have expressed concern in the media, I think in the comments here, that cutting out immigrants who may got deported because of a marijuana conviction, may not be able to get back in the country because of a marijuana conviction. Doesn't seem right to them, to the extent that the president is saying that nobody should suffer consequences for simple marijuana possession. First, I guess I want you to have to state again with clarity that they're not covered. And then I guess the question is there talk either in your office or with folks at the White House about whether another round of blanket pardons, or at the very least that individual petitions coming from undocumented individuals that only have a marijuana possession conviction on their record might get fast-tracked in some way? Is there any sense from your office about an effort to address what's seen as a gap in the initial round of blanket pardons?
So any individual is always able to apply for a pardon under our traditional process for granting pardons. President Biden's proclamation was in addition to the traditional process for considering pardons. And one thing that we consider in every case where an individual is seeking a pardon is individualized need for that type of relief. So if an individual has a compelling need for a pardon in order to avoid a specific collateral consequence, such as potential removal from the United States or inability to re-enter the country, then that is absolutely something that would be considered by the office on an individualized basis in connection with the pardon application. You're correct that the proclamation was limited in scope to U.S. citizens and lawful permanent residents, so that particular means of relief is only available to covered individuals. But I would encourage anyone who is suffering collateral consequences that could be ameliorated by grant of a pardon to use our traditional pardon application and to apply for relief through that means. A lot of information is available on our website about how to apply for a pardon, and we've got an application form that's available on the website as well. And I would encourage individuals who are applying to highlight the specific ways in which they're being affected by collateral consequences of a conviction, because that is a factor that will be weighted heavily in considering the application.
Thank you very much. While I've got you, there's a very detailed, specific question. How soon do you predict the pardon certificates will be in the hands of people covered by the president's proclamation? And can you talk more about what steps your office needed to take to sort of gear up that process? And to some extent, feel free to complain about having a lot of work because the president granted a lot of pardons, but curious just sort of about the nuts and bolts there.
So absolutely no complaint from me or from my colleagues in the Office of the Pardon Attorney. We're very excited about what the president has done here and about the role that we are playing in implementing it. So no complaints whatsoever. I would like to talk a little bit about the process that the office has undertaken to launch this application process. As I mentioned in the beginning, the proclamation tasks the Attorney General through the Office of the Pardon Attorney to develop this process and administer this process for issuing certificates of pardon. I want to reiterate that no one needs a certificate of pardon to be pardoned. Anyone who is covered by the proclamation has been pardoned as of the date the president signed that document on October 6th. However, we are developing a process so that we can issue these certificates, which are essentially individualized proof that an individual's conviction has been pardoned. Some individuals may want to have these certificates in order to get the full benefits of the pardon. We are working on developing a very simple and very streamlined process for application. And it sometimes turns out in government that making something simple takes longer than making it complicated and just implementing it as quickly as possible. So we are trying to make sure that we have a really good, really simple and streamlined process in place that is imposes as little burden as possible on applicants. We are working on developing a web-based application form, which anyone who's familiar with the clemency application process will know is not currently available for our traditional clemency and pardon applications. But we are hoping that we can expedite the process for applicants and for our review by using a web-based platform. So we are working very closely with the Department of Justice's IT department to develop and launch a web-based submission platform so that individuals can simply fill in their information online, click a button, submit the application, and it's done. That will also put the information into a format that makes it easier for us to quickly review and process these applications for certificates. So that's one piece of it. The final application, which is very far along in the process now, is likely going to be a one-pager, which requires inclusion of some basic personal information and information about the date and court of conviction. There'll be an attestation requiring the applicant to state that the information provided is truthful. And that's pretty much it. My hope is that it would take no more than 10 minutes for most people to complete this application. Once it is submitted, and by the way, we'll have this web-based submission platform, but also the option to submit the application by mail or email for individuals who may be more comfortable with those formats. The quickest way to do it will be to use the web-based submission platform, and the quickest way for us to review it will be through that platform. But traditional submission formats are also going to be accepted and processed as well. The most important thing in our review process is going to be to verify that the applicant has a qualifying conviction. As I mentioned before, the conviction has to be for marijuana possession, so the proclamation doesn't cover other types of drug possession. The conviction has to be for possession only. It cannot be for distribution or another offense related to marijuana. And the conviction has to be federal or under the DC code. So we'll have to verify that it's a conviction that meets all of those requirements, because we can't issue certificates for state court convictions, for example. So in order to facilitate that part of our review, we are going to ask applicants if they have readily available documentation to upload that documentation along with their application. You've got court documents and you can just upload them along with your application, and that'll make it very quick for us to process the request. If the applicant does not have that documentation available, that's not disqualifying. We will use our traditional means of investigation to try to locate the record of conviction so that we can process those applications as quickly as possible as well. But the most expeditious way to get a certificate will be to submit the web-based application form and some documentation along with it, which will allow us to expedite consideration. We hope to launch this very soon. We've been working very hard to get the platform up and running and make it as user-friendly as possible and make sure that it actually works before we roll it out to the public. And once we start accepting applications, we'll endeavor to issue them as quickly as possible. I would encourage anybody who is considering applying for one of these certificates to check back our website frequently. We update it regularly. We will be adding new FAQs and other content once the application launches that will provide comprehensive instructions about how to complete the application. There's a lot of information on our website that I think will be helpful to folks. And if you cannot get your question answered by reference to our website, I would encourage you just to send an email to the address that's on our website. That's our general inbox for inquiries. We respond to pretty much everything we receive, and someone in my office will be able to help if there's a question that can't be answered by reference to our website.
So at the risk of asking a follow-up question you may not have an answer to, so January, February, if somebody really wants to or has a reason they want that piece of paper and have the certificate and they're confident they can get the information to you as soon as the website goes live, could they reasonably hope first couple months of next year they'd have that certificate?
I hope it'll be very soon that we can launch this. We want to get it right, rather than do it as quickly as possible. So as soon as it is ready, we will launch it. I hope that'll be very soon. And if someone has a pressing inquiry, that is absolutely the type of thing that you can contact my office about. We've dealt with situations involving individuals who are on supervision for a marijuana related offense that might be covered by the proclamation, other types of situations that are really time sensitive, and we've been able to address those appropriately and I think get good outcomes for individuals who are affected. So if there's a really compelling set of circumstances that requires an individual to have their case considered before the process is up and running, that's absolutely something that we can and have done. But before we launch this this application. We want to make sure we've got it 100% right. And I'm very hopeful that we'll be doing that very soon.
Very good. And one other question, which I hadn't even thought of, but that comes up in the comments or the questions. Will the court records of that conviction in any way reflect that a pardon's been given? That's maybe a broader question of, other than getting the certificate, is there going to be any way for individuals affected or people who are checking the backgrounds of individuals who are affected to have an official documentation showing that a pardon's been granted for that offense?
Yeah, so in terms of whether a court uploads the documents, that's a practice that in the pardon context varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And some courts, pardon documents are routinely uploaded to the document. In some jurisdictions, they're not. And that's something that would be determined by the court. But one thing that we will do, and that there'll be further information provided on our website about, is provide some instructions for individuals who receive one of these certificates about how they can update CJIS. That's the FBI's Criminal Justice Information System. I may have said that wrong, but it's CJIS. It stands for something. And that's where most criminal records nationally are housed. And we'll provide some instructions for how individuals who have a certificate can provide that certificate to the FBI so that CJIS can be updated. And so that if someone were to run their records, if that marijuana conviction pops up, then there will be a statement that it was pardoned by the president's proclamation.
Wonderful, thank you. And I'm going to kind of take your very helpful explanation of kind of where we are and how this all works practically as kind of a general question to Jana and Sarah, because I think this is an issue that comes up. I'll certainly speak to this when President Obama started his clemency initiative. My attitude was like, all right, where are the grants? I'm waiting. Come on, what's taking so long? And it was very, very obvious pretty darn quickly that putting together the paperwork, getting files developed, making the applications effective, even when you have a very willing president or a very willing governor, is an extraordinary lift, especially for the individuals who may not be able to afford counsel, may not even know how to access counsel, or even understand what the process practically is, or these distinctions between getting a pardon or a commutation from a governor and getting record relief, whether it's expungement or record sealing, however it's defined, from a court. And so I guess I'd just love sort of your perspectives on, what are best practices here? What's the way in which, whether we're talking about thinking about reform at the federal level, and I know there's a bill that's been introduced in Congress to reform the clemency process, though I don't think that's likely to get enacted anytime soon. But what's the balance, as sort of Liz put it, between sometimes it's easier to make things complicated but have it out there than to try to make it simple and straightforward, because that adds its own sets of challenges and complications. I think one variation on this theme, just to provide a statistic that is depressingly telling in this setting, I believe it was outgoing Pennsylvania Governor Wolf announced a month-long campaign to get people to apply for a pardon through their processes for marijuana offenses, and over 2,500 people applied, and at first accounting only 230 people were eligible based on their criteria, right? Got a lot of people excited, a lot of people hopeful, presumably a lot of people did a lot of work to submit the application, and then it turns out that 90% of them didn't fit the terms of what had been put forward as the program, and that just is disappointing for everybody involved. And I'm just sort of curious, from your work, at the state level or across the board with not just clemency but also record relief, is there a happy medium there where the process isn't too onerous, but at the same time we make sure that people know that they're eligible or can easily figure out and get the help they need to document what's necessary to benefit from these potential remedies?
Well, I could just jump in here and say the difference between President Biden's marijuana program and President Obama's clemency program obviously is that one was self-executing. One has the pardon under the Biden program. Under the Obama program, obviously these were individuals who are already incarcerated and serving long sentences, and an individual an individualized review was sort of required and mandated. And then representation was so critical to that, because you're dealing with individuals who've been in custody a long time, may not have access to the documents, the materials. And at the end of the day, sort of the arguments that could be made to support their relief. And so they needed representation. It seems to me the Biden marijuana program isn't requiring representation. It's just going to be a process, a formalized process that people could hopefully do online. And it's worth waiting for it to have it rolled out to be accurate and workable for them without representation. That, of course, brings us to the broader question of what are we going to do with the 70 million people with a criminal record? How are we going to implement expungement, record clearing, restoration of rights programs across states, which are not self-executing, but actually require a balancing of factors and a decision about whether you meet criteria? And, it brings us back to really the larger need to harness our judiciary. We have, 700 or 800 federal judges, we have thousands of state judges. We have a whole infrastructure for handling that. And I know those courts are going to balk at the idea that you're handing me with this requirement now to go back and review old cases and make decisions about deciding whether the person should be restored to rights or their record sealed. But, I almost feel like it's a moral imperative for our system that we take that obligation on and that we harness the judges. Liz's office is fantastic, but it's a small office and been given a very tall order. And there's so much that her office is handling right now, beyond just the marijuana pardons. So we have a much larger infrastructure to harness through the judiciary. I did want to add one other point when you were, and Sarah can talk about this more deeply, is, these wonderful statutes coming from the states in expunging the marijuana convictions. There's an amazing social justice aspect to these too. And it's I think it's Missouri, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Maryland have all included the idea that if you were somebody who had one of these convictions that's now expunged, you almost get a priority in getting a license to distribute marijuana. So it's an amazing sort of reparations process that's occurring along with the expungement. It's also the recognition that the criminalization impacted you and your communities, has an intergenerational impact. And there's a reparational aspect to saying, we prioritize you to now get these pretty lucrative licenses to distribute marijuana. So I just, whoever came up with that idea, I just think that's such a brilliant idea. Beautiful. So Sarah may speak more to that.
Well, first, to answer your question, Doug, similarly to Jane Ann, my response is going to be that I don't have a good solution for fixing a petition-based process. And the solution is not a petition-based process. We are not going to see true impact and true relief for the tens of thousands of individuals that are still incarcerated on cannabis-related sentences, the tens of millions of people, hundreds of millions of people that still have cannabis offenses on their record through the clemency process. It is simply not built for that kind of scaled impact at the federal or state level. And at the state level, not every governor has blanket clemency power. Not every governor is empowered to effectuate these kinds of categorical or offense-based commutations or pardons. So we have to look to legislative solutions, both in terms of resentencing, as well as to effectuate record clearance. And when we're doing that, these processes have to be automated or made automatic or self-effectuating, as Liz said, through the state. We see a similar trend in terms of the petition-based process around record clearance. Nationally, what we're seeing in terms of people actually apply through petition-based expungements or record clearance or sealance processes hovers around 6%. what scholars call this uptake gap in terms of individuals that are eligible to apply for petition-based record clearance that are actually applying and getting granted that relief is so monumentally low because of all the things that we're discussing. Because even in a state like Massachusetts, where I started doing this work in terms of record clearance, the state had created a petition-based process that I think lawyers, those really versed in the law, thought was as simple as it could be, but it was still really difficult for individuals who maybe English was not their first language. They didn't have access to technology to get the resources that existed on the internet. They couldn't fill out the form electronically. They didn't have a way to access their record that wouldn't cost them financially. So we really need to find ways that the onus is on the state to identify individuals and to proactively clear their records and look for opportunities for sentence modification as well. That's something we're looking to here in Connecticut, where luckily the governor announced that they are effectuating the record clearance that was built into the legalization bill. That's set to happen in January. There's going to be tens of thousands of people who automatically have their records cleared. What's not happening yet in Connecticut and in most states is a process where the state is trying to identify those that are still incarcerated on cannabis-related sentences. Here in Connecticut, a problem that exists in other states as well, is that the prison operating system does not designate marijuana as an offense in their system. So when someone is incarcerated on a marijuana-related offense, it's a broad drug category. It doesn't state specifically that it's for marijuana. That doesn't mean that there aren't solutions. I think, unfortunately, I've seen a lot of states, when we go and try to push kind of our gold standard for either resentencing or record clearance, the state will simply say, we can't do this. Those records don't exist. We don't designate marijuana in that way. There are still solutions. There are still absolutely ways that the state could be putting resources into actually going back to arrest records, the docket, to identify those individuals. And if that's too burdensome on the state, we can still be doing a better job at messaging these petition-based processes like we saw in Pennsylvania that will expedite the process for people with cannabis offenses. And I think that's part of the problem, again, is education, awareness, making sure we're really getting the message out there that these processes exist, but also providing resources and tools for individuals to actually go through that process. And so a call to anyone who is trying to do that federally, Last Prisoner Project can absolutely assist with getting these certificates at the federal level, or if you're trying to secure clemency through the traditional means at the federal level, we have an initiative in conjunction with NACDL, our Cannabis Justice Initiative, where we match folks with pro bono attorneys. So those resources are available, but again, really, we need the state and the federal government to be looking for legislative solutions that would put the burden on the state to proactively secure these kinds of reliefs for individuals.
So legislative solutions is a good segue for me to shift back to Liz to ask a few questions, both about the marijuana space and the drug space more generally in the work of her office. First, on the marijuana space, we haven't seen federal marijuana reform other than a research bill recently, though there's been talk that maybe we would see some in this lame duck. None of it seems to be repealing prohibition in any significant degree. Doesn't that mean there are going to be people getting arrested since the proclamation and for the years to come for marijuana possession offenses in DC on federal property and in the federal system? Will there need to be another blanket pardon down the line? One of the questions in the chat asks, because those folks, as I understand it, aren't going to, there's no proactive pardoning. You're not allowed to do that. And so we're still at risk until we get some kind of legislative change to prohibition to have a growing class of individuals with this same problem.
So I think DC and federal and US code offenses would need to be looked at separately. DC has already taken some actions on its own with respect to marijuana criminalization that may affect whether it's really a live issue going forward in the District of Columbia. You're correct that federally, the statute is still on the books, Section 844, marijuana possession can still be charged. I think it remains to be seen whether it will still be widely charged or not in light of the action that the president took. Others on this panel have spoken about the symbolic value that the president's proclamation had. And I think it's really hard to deny that it does have a huge symbolic value. So I don't know what the future of marijuana possession will look like in the federal system. I'm not in a prosecuting office within the Department of Justice, so I don't really have a window into that. But I do think that certainly, the statement that the president made by issuing this proclamation will be relevant to the discussion of what that future looks like.
No, that's an excellent point. It's also another reminder that there needs to be lots of nuance here, both in terms of the way in which even presidential or gubernatorial action can impact, like you're saying, future prosecutions, but also in states that have fully legalized. Every state, to my knowledge, set 21 as the age for legal possession. So you'll have folks, underage that still can be subject to arrests, even in a legalization regime. Many states have limitations on public use or other forms of restrictions on how much you can carry. And again, there are still opportunities for people to be subject to criminal sanctions for marijuana possession at the state level, even after legalization, even though at the same time we would hope without legislative reform in Congress, we're going to see less use of that sanction that the president pardoned, but only could pardon retroactively on. Now I'd like to talk more generally. Sarah referenced it a little bit, Jane Ann did as well, sort of drug policy in general and the work of your office, Liz, going forward. I'm reading now from what was, I guess, President Biden's, it was candidate Biden's campaign literature. No one should be incarcerated for drug use alone. One of the things that those who focus on this area closely highlighted was he said drug use, not drug trafficking. But at the same time, he didn't just say marijuana use. He said drug use more generally, and obviously, roughly speaking, about half of the federal prison population is drug offenders, though almost exclusively for trafficking offenses. And that was another thing that the pardon data sussed out. But is it your sense, either both in your work in your office or maybe whatever communications you may have with folks at the White House about the president's priority, that it's not just marijuana offenders, but all low-level drug offenders, the folks that would arguably be able to claim whatever criminal activity they had was related to their drug use, are most likely to be within the ambit of who the president would be thinking about granting clemency to. I'm really asking both because there's a question about, how should I style a petition if I've got a sympathetic offender who's currently incarcerated, but also because, as much as we're trying to sort of see President Biden's work as symbolically important to other actors in the system, what more he might do, obviously informed by your office, could be as important, if not more important, than how this initial proclamation gets read.
So I consider my role to speak about the work that my office is doing. I want to be completely transparent with folks who are interested in clemency about what we are doing here in the Office of the Pardon Attorney. I'm not going to make predictions about what the president may or may not do, but I'm happy to tell you what we're prioritizing internally within my office. And drug cases are absolutely it. We have thousands of applications for commutation of sentence in drug cases. And the top priorities for us currently are the very many cases in which there is a clear indication that the sentence would be lower today as a result of the passage of the First Step Act. So we've got many, many, many cases that would have been affected by the First Step Act had they been prosecuted after that statute passed. And those are a top priority for us, ensuring that we review each and every one of those applications and make a recommendation that takes into consideration the sentencing disparity issue resulting from the First Step Act. We're also looking closely at marijuana cases. We're looking closely at crack cocaine cases. And there's an argument in many of those cases that the sentence would be significantly lower had the substance at issue been powder cocaine rather than crack cocaine. And that's both a matter of mandatory minimums and the sentencing guidelines. So crack disparity is another really big issue that we're looking at. And we're looking at mandatory minimums generally, as well as sentences that were imposed under the mandatory guidelines regime pre-Booker. So we still have a lot of cases in our queue where the guidelines today might still call for life, but the guidelines then were life and the guidelines were mandatory. And we're revisiting all of those life sentences and drug cases that resulted from mandatory guidelines. There's a lot of data from the Sentencing Commission indicating that life sentences in drug cases are very, very uncommon today, particularly without some very serious aggravating factors such as a death resulting from the drug distribution. So we're looking closely at all of those life sentences as well. And I would say that across the board, drug cases are the top priority for the office's review right now.
And so my last follow-up question there, and then I'll open it up to Jane Ann and Sarah. And is it primarily incarcerated individuals and looking at commutation petitions? Are there also a significant inflow of pardon applications? And, you know, is it really just, well, whatever you get in is what you look at? Or do you have kind of a role in proactively building a file even for folks who don't apply?
So we have some priorities that we've set that's sort of along the lines that I've described for how we review the cases, because as you know, we have a very large pool of cases, but we are actively reviewing both pardon applications and commutation applications. I don't know the exact breakdown, but I would estimate that about 80% of the cases that we have open are commutation requests. The pardon pool is much, much smaller. And even in the pardon pool, drug cases are a big priority for us. And as I said before, individuals who are suffering real specific concrete collateral consequences from their conviction are a high priority for us. Many of those are individuals who were convicted of drug offenses.
Thank you so much. And thank you for being as transparent as you have been about the work of your office. Jane Ann and Sarah, I don't know if, again, this is kind of a general advice, whether directed towards Liz or others who may be listening, in terms of that breakdown between pardons and commutations, or more broadly just the question of whether criminal justice reform is concerned about over punishment, over criminalization, and all the consequences that are flowing downstream still from that. Where's time and energy best spent? Is it trying to get old records eliminated through record relief and those kind of pretty available but still underused court processes? You mentioned the uptake being so low, Sarah. Or is it you got to start bailing where people are drowning, and those are the individuals who are in prison serving long prison terms for a range of offenses, obviously not just marijuana, not even just drug offenses. Often drug related offenses interact with whether it's firearm offenses or a range of other aggravators that lead to these very long sentences. Liz mentioned, where sometimes an alleged death is connected. Just your own take, I guess, maybe Jane Ann, describe the work of your clinic. Do you get, folks asking for pardon work, or is it mostly incarcerated individuals? And given that there's so much work to do, what's the sensible way to triage?
Well, I do occasionally get people seeking pardons, and we have a couple that we're working on, in part because we see them as symbolically representative of the larger group of people that really the legislature should be working on benefiting. But obviously our focus is primarily people who are incarcerated, the hierarchy of needs. We go with the person serving the long prison sentence that they're serving along with their families. I wanted to pick up on something that you said earlier about, and it was something Sarah was saying about the groundswell across the country of people supporting these initiatives. And Sarah highlighted the initiatives that they're working on in different states. Doug, you and Margie Love have been working on that amazing report from the two, the Drug Enforcement Policy Institute and the Collateral Consequences Center, which are looking at marijuana reforms. And, some of these are ballot initiatives. I mean, the Missouri initiative was a ballot initiative that not only expunged marijuana convictions, but all misdemeanor drug convictions and a whole bunch of felonies as well. And so what's really interesting is that public really supports this. It is I'm not sure the public ever really supported the war on drugs. There's a lot of research that questions whether this is just something politicians harnessed, with law and order rhetoric in the moment. But, the amazing thing is that people really support reform. They support decarceration. LPP, and Sarah can talk more about this, has done a bunch of surveys that show extraordinary support for this. And it's bipartisan. You might have a larger percentage of Democrats supporting these initiatives, but you get over 50% of Republicans supporting them. I do my own research, survey research on attitudes to mandatory minimums. And again, over 50% of Republicans support walking back those mandatory policies. So this is a bipartisan issue. Worth pointing out that the First Step Act was actually, a Republican bill, one of the most profound reform measures we've had in decades, and has resulted in thousands of individuals being released. The making the Fair Sentencing Act retroactive released thousands of individuals. Making compassionate release a defendant-driven mechanism released thousands of individuals. We do need to see the pardon process as a jumpstart, as a symbolic measure that really, brings us back to our humanity principles. But at the end of the day, it's not the answer. We have to go with a legislative solution.
And to echo that, we had two polls that came out in the wake of Biden's announcement of these pardons, a Monmouth poll and an Ipsos poll, and both showed a vast majority of Americans supporting this specific act of granting clemency to individuals with cannabis offenses. Of course, we've seen similar polling that shows that a broad majority of Americans support this kind of retroactive relief, whether it be record clearance or resentencing or commutations. And one of the bills, the States Reform Act, that is Republican driven, I would argue has the broadest criminal justice measures in terms of retroactive relief for those with cannabis convictions federally. So this is certainly a really popular issue. And of course, when we talk about clemency, whether at the federal or state level, it is always a political act because it is an executive power. It's something that those executive offices need to know that their constituency will support it. Luckily, we now have the data to show that Americans do support these kinds of efforts. But one thing I wanted to make sure I touched on that came up when both Jane Ann and Liz were speaking is Americans don't just support this kind of retroactive relief for those with simple possession offenses. One thing that we talk about in our work, and Jane Ann, to sort of the social justice implications of these kinds of measures, particularly in states that have fully legalized and have a regulated market for cannabis. Of course, we now have individuals, and mostly white individuals, who are selling 10 times what someone, and most likely a person of color, might have sold that resulted in a decades-long or even a life sentence. And so when we're talking about retroactive relief, we really have to envision a world in which states, and hopefully at some point the federal government, is thinking about relief for a broader category of individuals than just those with possession offenses, especially as we look towards a fully regulated market at the federal level. Those conversations have to include how we're going to provide relief for those that are still incarcerated federally. And what we know in the wake of this announcement is that those individuals are not people with simple possession offenses. They have other charges, whether that be distribution or conspiracy charge, money laundering charge, as a result of cannabis-related activity. And so we have to find solutions to release those that are still incarcerated, both at the state and federal level, for any kind of cannabis-related offense. Because as Jane Ann said, we have this moral imperative. It is the height of injustice that we have some individuals that can now profit in the millions of billions of dollars. We have states that are raking in billions of dollars in tax revenue, and yet we have families, communities that have been devastated because of mass incarceration, driven in large part because of the war on drugs and because of cannabis offenses.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I appreciate that. I'm going to prepare all of you that we're getting a few minutes away from the end of our time together, and I want to give each of you a last minute or two to suggest sort of action items for those still listening on, what you'd recommend for them to do. And I'm going to ask you that first, Liz, although before we get to that, there's a great question that scratches my data itch, which is your office going to be tracking any kind of demographic data or age data, other possible specifics concerning who actually applies for these certificates as compared to what we know about the total population that has received these pardons? As I'm sure you know, my belief is that it's just from the U.S. Sentencing Commission. We've got a partial data accounting for the data they have. It's pretty good data going back to 92, but obviously there are people before 92 who got marijuana possession convictions, and so it's not a complete data set there. And I think I'll certainly speak for myself. It'll be interesting to see if there are some sort of demographic imbalances in who actually applies for the certificate relative to the population that's affected. Is that something that your office is going to be collecting data on? Or again, it's one of those challenges of if you keep it simple, you won't have that data, but I think that's data that will be real interesting if you're planning to collect it and report on who's actually asking for the certificates.
Yeah, we are planning to collect some basic demographic data. This is not something that historically we've really done with our applications for pardon and commutation, but it's an area of interest to me because I think understanding the impact that different policies have on different demographics of people is very important. And I've had some discussions with experts on this issue, including the department's chief statistician. And it seems that the prevailing view now is that it's better to have the data than not to have the data. So we do plan to collect that type of data and hope that it will be useful in analyzing the effect that this action has had. I will say that we're well aware of the fact that President Biden's pardon proclamation may demographically affect a different set of people than the people who actually end up applying for a certificate of pardon. So we're conscious of that. And there are some limits to the data that we're able to collect from our applicant pool, but it does seem like useful data to have, and we do intend to collect that.
Great, thank you very much. So now the action item, what would you recommend folks who would presumably like to see President Biden grant more clemencies, or just support the work that your office is doing and trying to ensure that the clemency power at the federal level and also across the country gets used robustly? Do you have recommendations, suggestions? Don't call you, I assume, as part of that to tell you to grant more clemencies, since that's not your responsibility, it's the president's, but just suggestions of what folks listening in who care about these issues you think they can usefully do to help advance the conversation.
So I think events like this, keeping the conversation going about the important role that the clemency power plays in achieving objectives related to criminal justice reform is extremely important. And I think keeping the spotlight on the important issue that clemency plays is a great idea. And I encourage everyone with a platform to do so, to assist with that. I consider myself a partner in these conversations and discussions about how we can advance objectives related to clemency. I too am hopeful that the president will use the clemency power in an impactful way to achieve some of the administration's objectives around criminal justice reform. And I hope that folks will feel free to call upon me and my office to assist in any way we can in clarifying what the process entails, how to apply, anything that folks may need to know to be able to put their best foot forward in submitting an application for clemency. We're involved in a lot of outreach currently. We're preparing to launch a series of trainings within the Bureau of Prisons, for example, so that we can educate individuals who are incarcerated about how to effectively apply for a commutation. And I want the office to be viewed as a resource for individuals who are going through the process and families of individuals who are going through the process, so that we can work together to hopefully accomplish impactful things.
Well, thank you. And I can just say, your graciousness in joining us for this panel and supporting the work that we're doing here it goes a long way to signaling effectively to all those who may be interested in the work of your office that it's a terrifically run office that is there to serve the people it's there to serve. So thank you so much for participating with us. We're very grateful. Jane Ann, Sarah, last thoughts, action items, suggestions?
Well, just picking up on what Liz said, we're talking about individuals here and their families, and I really appreciate just how much her office has centered the human component in her work as a pardon attorney. I just want to do a couple of action items to whoever is listening who has the power to do this. Liz's office has a very small number of lawyers, but they are analyzing all those thousands of clemency petitions and making recommendations and identifying very deserving people. There is a mechanism for benefiting these people, which is beyond the pardon power, which President Biden could harness. He could tell his attorney general, have your prosecutors stop opposing compassionate release motions. I mean, across the board, I'm almost shocked sometimes when I see those prosecutors come in and oppose very deserving compassionate release motions. I have an obese individual who we're doing a clemency petition for right now. He's over 300 pounds. And the prosecutor in that case had the audacity to write in the response to the compassionate release motion, he's eating his way out of prison. It's just such a terrible thing to say. And yet, had there been a call from above to say, look at these petitions, see deserving people who've served 10 years without a blemish in prison. There's no reason for them to serve another 5 or 6 years. Support the compassionate release motion. We could get thousands of people out tomorrow with individualized reviews from federal prosecutors across the country if we only had that direction from above. So that's one step, I would say. The other step is the Sentencing Commission can do a lot. They can change, there are things they can do with prior criminal records, making pardoned cases ones that would not count for criminal history points, for example. There's a very limited way in which they count right now, and that could be erased, and making this stuff retroactive. I mean, and there's so much the Sentencing Commission could do to really avoid this bloated federal incarcerated population, which itself is replicated at the state level. Legislatures obviously can start passing the kinds of laws that Sarah and her project are supporting, and the defense community itself needs to step up to the plate and do a lot more pro bono work representing these individuals.
And one last pitch, we make that really easy for attorneys. Cannabis Justice Initiative, you can go to our website if you're an attorney, participate in those pro bono efforts. But yeah, I think as Jane Ann is saying, there are so many reform measures that can be taken to try to address all of the issues with our criminal legal system. Unfortunately, for criminal justice reformers like those of us on this call, like our organizations, it's a really fraught time to be doing this work. So much of the wins that we've been championing over the past couple of years are really at risk. I think we're being defensive because of the national context around these types of reforms. But the reason why we are doing this work at Last Prisoner Project, the reason why I think we're having this conversation is that criminal justice measures in relation to the war on drugs, and particularly in relation to cannabis prohibition, because of the changing landscape around its legalization, are really achievable wins, both legislatively and at the executive level, because as we've said, this has huge bipartisan support. People recognize that if we're going to legalize something, if we're going to change these laws, there should be, in conjunction with that, retroactive relief for those who are still suffering from the consequences of prohibition. So at a time when we might not be able to get all the wins that we want to see in terms of reforming our criminal legal system, this is something that we can be focused on, that I believe is achievable, and that can then be infrastructure building, that can be the plan for broader reforms moving forward. If we can achieve things like commutations or clemency at scale, automatic record clearance at scale for cannabis offenses, my hope is that that can lead to similar enactions of these kinds of mechanisms for other types of offenses. So that's the hope that I will end this conversation with. And also want to thank Liz for being so open to these conversations, for her office being so solutions oriented. We all really appreciate it and appreciate you being here today.
Well, thank you all, and I'm not surprised because there was so much to discuss that we're a few minutes over, but I'll finish with a very simple action item in some sense, which is that I hope everybody participating joins me in thanking folks at both the Last Prisoner Project and here at the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center for helping to put this terrific discussion together. I especially want to emphasize that a report that was referenced in some of the conversation, a report that the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center and the Collateral Consequences Resource Center is putting together about marijuana relief mechanisms in recent laws, that should be live and available very soon, and that will go out to all registrants with the recording of this event and that report, I think, probably next week. With that, I apologize for having to run out of time with still more to discuss, but I am so incredibly grateful for all of you who participated in joining us, and thank you to our panelists. So helpful, so informative, and we'll get you next time. Hopefully, there'll be another round of pardons, maybe at the state level, maybe at the federal level, for us to get together and discuss before too long. So thank you again. Really grateful for your time, and be well, everybody. Have a good holiday season.
Thanks, everybody.